Terry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Terry Leahy. I've been involved in permaculture for a very long time. I did my PhD in 1997 up at Tialgum, and before that, I read Permaculture 1 in about 1978, just after it came out. I remember I was always interested, et cetera, et cetera. I'm an academic. A sociologist. I've been involved in doing lots of research in developing countries, especially in Africa. That'll do, I think.
Thanks. I've been teaching the Certificate 3, and there's a few questions we could cover about community, operating within a community, seeing as you've been in different community settings. Do you feel that there could be a link between, or an influence from the bioregion? How can that influence the community? The different bioregions. Do you think that's possible? Different climates might have an effect on how the community operates?
Not really a determining effect. I mean, I just think. I think globally, what we're looking at present is the global dominance of capitalist culture, and what we even in, you go to a remote village in Africa, you're still getting that as the dominant cultural theme. At the same time, people in particular places are influenced by their own history, and of course their own history is a history in that place. And I mean, it's inevitably influenced by the bioregion. You can't get away from that. At the same time, it's influenced by a whole lot of specific historical decisions, inventions. So here's a classic example. If you go to a village in Africa, pre-colonial times, everyone was growing cereal crops that were really well adapted to the African climate. That was millet and sorghum mostly. Now, what happened then by about the 1600s, really early on, the Portuguese introduced maize into Africa. Now, initially, maize was just a sort of additional crop that you might grow when you had a wet, rainy season. However, in the 1900s, the colonial governments in this part of East and South Africa realised that it was a really good crop to be growing to feed the miners. They were recruiting African men into mining, and so it became the dominant crop in the rural villages in Africa, initially as a sort of cash crop to feed African miners. And then what's happening now is that in those post-colonial societies of that area, maize has become the dominant cereal crop for subsistence farmers. So in other words, the rural poor of these areas are using this as a huge part of their carbohydrate consumption is being produced on their own farms for their own household consumption. And it's almost always maize. I mean, there are areas where it's cassava, but in the areas where it's maize, which is like 70 or 80% of those areas, sorghum and millet are just a sort of subsidiary minor crop now, and maize is the main crop that people eat. And things like sweet potato and cassava, which are and sorghum and millet, which actually do much better in the African climate, are hardly grown, and certainly people can starve if their maize crop fails. And the other thing is maize requires a lot of rainfall and also requires a lot of nutrients. And so you cut down the forest in the first 5 years after the maize is growing really well, and then it's less and less and less and less. And then, of course, with climate change, there's lots more droughts. But even before that, there's like a drought every 3 years and so on, and the maize crop doesn't do too well. So in other words, what you've got there is a situation which is specific to that bioregion. You can't understand that without looking at the climate, the rainfall, the current climate change stuff, the soil quality, and various species, like sorghum, millet, maize, cassava, sweet potato, what I've all been talking about. These are material realities that you can't get around. But at the same time, to understand what's happening, I've gone into an excursion where I've talked about history, particular political decisions that were made by particular players in that historical setting. and a cultural norm now, which is maize is the only real food. You know, like all of these are not, you can't explain them by just talking about a bioregion like a climate zone or something. Okay, that'll do it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to keep that